Everybody thought the electric vehicle race was the only industrial story worth watching. Tesla against BYD, Detroit against Shanghai, showroom against showroom. But while every camera in the world was pointed at that fight, a much bigger transformation was happening somewhere nobody was filming. It was happening inside mines. It was happening on the docks. It was happening on construction sites the size of small cities. And almost nobody noticed. For the last 10 years, the story we were told was simple. China was catching up in passenger cars. Western automakers were nervous about BYD's growth, nervous about Tesla's Shanghai factory, nervous about cheap Chinese sedans flooding emerging markets. That story was real, but it was also a distraction, because while journalists and analysts obsessed over who would sell the most electric hatchbacks, an entirely different industrial empire was being built in silence. An empire made not of cars, but of machines. The machines that dig, that lift, that haul, that pour concrete and move mountains of earth. The machines that quite literally build the modern world. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Heavy industrial equipment, the excavators, the mining trucks, the port cranes, the bulldozers, the forklifts, is arguably more strategically important than passenger vehicles. Because this equipment is what extracts the lithium, the cobalt, and the rare earth elements that every electric car, every wind turbine, and every modern weapon system depends on. Without this machinery, there is no battery supply chain. Without this machinery, there is no infrastructure boom. Without this machinery, nothing else gets built at all. And while Detroit, Munich, and Tokyo kept their engineers focused on consumer vehicles, Chinese industrial giants were quietly building the machines that build everything else. So why did nobody notice? Simple. Consumer cars are visible. You see them in your driveway, in your neighbor's garage, in the commercials that interrupt your football games. A container crane loading ships in Long Beach or Charleston is invisible, unless you happen to be standing at the port at exactly the right moment. Nobody makes a documentary about a mining truck the size of a two-story house hauling rock out of a copper pit in the middle of nowhere. There is no glamour in a bulldozer. There is no red carpet for an excavator. And that invisibility is exactly why this transformation was able to happen so quickly and so completely, without triggering the kind of political panic that greeted Chinese electric sedans arriving on American soil. Let's talk about the numbers, because they are almost impossible to ignore once you see them laid out together. The global construction equipment market in the year 2025 was worth roughly $246.6 billion. Caterpillar, the American giant, is still technically the largest single player, holding around 15.2% of that market, worth about $37.5 billion in sales. That sounds like American dominance, and in some sense, it still is. But look one level deeper. Three Chinese companies, XCMG, Sany, and Zoomlion, are now sitting inside the global top 10 manufacturers, with combined sales exceeding $30 billion. 10 years ago, that would have sounded impossible. Today, it's simply the new normal. XCMG alone generated $14.2 billion in sales in 2025, making it the third largest construction equipment manufacturer on the planet. Sany isn't far behind at just over $10 billion. These aren't small regional players anymore. These are companies going head-to-head with Caterpillar, Komatsu, and Liebherr on a global stage, and doing it while undercutting Western prices by 20 to 40%, all while closing the quality gap faster than anyone in Detroit or Illinois predicted. Now here is the fact that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. In the year 2025, China's construction machinery exports reached $60.17 billion, a jump of 13.8% in a single year. And if you zoom out to all Chinese machinery exports combined, not just construction equipment, but the entire industrial machinery category, the number for 2024 was $869 billion. Let that sink in for a second. $869 billion in 1 year from one country in machinery alone. China didn't just enter this industry. China became its largest exporter on planet Earth, overtaking Germany, the country that essentially invented modern industrial engineering sometime around 2020 or 2021. But the real golden fact, the detail almost nobody outside the shipping industry talks about, is this one. A single Chinese company, Shanghai Zhenhua Heavy Industries, known by its acronym ZPMC, controls approximately 80% of all ship-to-shore cranes currently operating in United States ports. 80%. Think about what that actually means. Every time a massive container ship pulls into an American port, there is a very high chance that the crane lifting those containers off the deck was built in Shanghai. Shanghai. This isn't a minor supply chain detail. This is control over the physical machinery that moves the vast majority of global trade through American harbors. And it happened so gradually, so quietly, that it barely made headlines until members of the United States House Homeland Security Committee began raising national security concerns about it in 2024. Now let's talk about mining, because this is where the story gets even stranger. Autonomous mining trucks, giant driverless vehicles that haul rock and ore out of massive open pit mines, are one of the fastest growing segments in heavy industry. As of July 2025, there were 3,832 autonomous haul trucks operating worldwide. China alone operated 2,090 of them. That's 54% of the entire global fleet running inside one country. Caterpillar and Komatsu still lead when you count which brand built the trucks. But when you count where these machines are actually deployed and put to work at scale, China isn't just participating in the autonomous mining revolution. China is the autonomous mining revolution. So how did this happen? How did a country that Western manufacturers once dismissed as a source of cheap knockoffs become the dominant force in heavy industrial machinery within roughly 2 decades? The answer isn't luck and it isn't magic. It's supply chain control executed with almost frightening precision. China produces around 75% of the world's lithium-ion battery cells, 70% of battery cathodes, and 85% of battery anodes. Two Chinese companies, CATL and BYD, together control more than half of the entire global electric vehicle battery market. China also controls roughly 70% of global rare earth mining and about 90% of rare earth processing capacity. And on top of all of that, China produces 54% of the world's steel, more than 1 billion metric tons in the year 2023 alone. Now connect those dots. If you control the batteries, you control electrification. If you control the rare earths, you control the specialty steels and magnets that go into modern machinery. If you control the steel, you control the raw material for literally everything that gets built. Heavy industrial equipment sits at the exact intersection of all three of those advantages. It's not a coincidence that Chinese companies are leading in electric mining trucks and electric construction equipment. It's the natural result of already dominating the ingredients those machines are made from. There's a technical detail worth mentioning here, because it shows just how deep this advantage runs. Chinese manufacturers have started integrating rare earth elements directly into specialty steels used in mining trucks and heavy machinery components at a cost of roughly $10 to $50 per ton in exchange for a 5 to 15% improvement in material strength and durability. That might sound like a small technical footnote, but at industrial scale, across millions of tons of steel every year, that kind of durability advantage compounds into a massive competitive edge, one that Western manufacturers who don't have the same access to cheap rare earth supply simply cannot replicate as easily or as cheaply. Let's zoom out for a moment and picture the scale of what's actually being built here, because raw numbers can be hard to feel emotionally. Imagine a single autonomous mining truck. These machines are roughly the size of a 2-story house, capable of hauling loads that would crush an ordinary dump truck. Now imagine 2,090 of them operating simultaneously 24 hours a day across mining regions inside China. That's not a factory, that's an entire mechanized workforce, larger than the population of some small towns, and it never sleeps, never takes a lunch break, and never asks for a raise. Or picture this instead. Every ship-to-shore crane in a major port looks like a skyscraper laid on its side, capable of lifting containers weighing tens of thousands of pounds, 60, 70, sometimes over 100 feet into the air. 8 out of every 10 of those towering steel structures currently working American ports were built by a single Chinese state-linked company. If you've ever driven past a port and looked up at those enormous cranes towering over the skyline, there's a very good chance you were looking at Chinese industrial engineering without even realizing it. So where does that leave the United States, and specifically Detroit? Here's the part that deserves nuance, because the easy, lazy version of this story is to say Detroit simply gave up on heavy industry. That's not accurate, and it's not fair. Caterpillar is still the largest construction equipment manufacturer on Earth by revenue. John Deere recently announced a $20 billion investment in United States manufacturing over the next 10 years, including new excavator production facilities. American industrial engineering did not disappear. What actually happened is more subtle, and in some ways more dangerous, because it's harder to see and harder to fix. American investment, American media attention, and American public imagination became almost entirely absorbed by passenger vehicles, especially the electric vehicle race, while China expanded aggressively and simultaneously across nearly every adjacent industrial category: ports, mining, construction, logistics. Robotics, all at once. And speaking of robotics, here's another number that rarely makes headlines outside of trade publications. China's industrial robot stock reached 2.03 million units in 2024, roughly 52% of the entire global total. So this isn't only about trucks and cranes. It's about the automated systems inside factories that build the trucks and cranes in the first place. China didn't just win one layer of the industrial stack. China positioned itself to compete at nearly every layer simultaneously. From the robots on the factory floor, to the batteries powering the machines, to the finished equipment rolling out the door. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, because it's genuinely uncertain and reasonable people disagree about the answer. If Chinese companies already dominate port cranes, already lead in autonomous mining deployment, and already control the battery and rare earth supply chains that power the next generation of electric heavy equipment, is there actually a realistic path for Western manufacturers to close that gap? Or has the industrial equipment race already been quietly decided, years before most people even realized it was happening? Caterpillar still has brand trust built over a century. Komatsu still leads in certain autonomous technologies. But brand trust and technical leadership in one narrow category may not be enough to offset a rival that controls the raw materials, the batteries, and the manufacturing scale underneath the entire industry. That's not a comfortable question, but it's the honest one. What makes this story genuinely important, beyond just industrial trivia, is what heavy equipment actually enables downstream. Mining equipment extracts the lithium and cobalt that power every electric vehicle battery on Earth. Port cranes move roughly 80% of global trade through container shipping. Construction equipment builds the roads, bridges, and energy infrastructure that every economy depends on to function. Whoever controls the machines that extract, transport, and build controls an enormous amount of leverage over the global economy, arguably more leverage than whoever simply sells the most sedans in a given quarter. A slowdown in electric vehicle sales is a headline. A disruption in port crane manufacturing, mining truck availability, or construction equipment supply chains would be a genuine economic emergency, and right now, an enormous share of that machinery either comes from China or depends on Chinese-controlled battery and rare earth supply chains to function at all. This is why the real industrial revolution of this decade wasn't happening in showrooms. It was happening inside factories, mines, ports, and construction sites, in places most people never think to look. While the world debated which electric sedan looked better or which company had the flashier keynote presentation, an entire parallel industry was being quietly reshaped, machine by machine, ton of steel by ton of steel, until one day the numbers simply couldn't be ignored anymore. So here's where this story actually lands, and it's not the ending most people expect. China didn't steal the heavy equipment industry from Detroit. Nobody stole anything. China built an entirely new industrial ecosystem from the ground up, brick by brick, factory by factory, while Western manufacturers focused their attention, their capital, and their headlines on consumer vehicles. Today, Chinese companies dominate port cranes, lead the world in autonomous electric mining deployment, and are closing the gap on Western giants in construction machinery, all while American and European engineers remain genuinely excellent in specific technical categories. The real question was never whether China took over an industry. The real question is whether the West woke up in time to realize that whoever builds the machines that build the world ends up shaping the future far more than whoever sells the most cars in a given year. Because here's the truth that gets lost in every flashy headline about electric vehicle market share. Countries don't become industrial superpowers by building only the products people can see parked in a driveway. They become industrial superpowers by building the machines that build everything else. The cranes, the trucks, the excavators, the quiet, unglamorous steel giants working 24 hours a day in places most of us will never visit. And if that transformation can happen this completely without most of the world noticing, it raises an uncomfortable question about what other industries might be shifting right now, in the same silence, right under everyone's radar. If you don't want to be caught off guard by whatever comes next in this industry, join us here on Driven to Distraction, because the next shift might be closer to your own garage than you think.